Welcome, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for coming to this very special, first of its kind, Nature Nerd Chat collaboration with the Nature, Art, and Habitat Residency Program. I am quite excited about this. I've been doing a few Nature Nerd Chats so far, and this is the first one, obviously in collaboration. I actually am a Nature, Art, and Habitat Residency Fellow from 2022. Sarah, who is my wonderful co-host, was a fellow last year. And so part of this chat today is we're going to tell you a little bit in the beginning about NAHR, as we call it, Nature, Art, and Habitat Residency. And then we're going to pass it over to Monica, and we're going to hear about really cool stuff. I don't know. I think the idea of beneficial fire is something that is not talked about enough in our culture, and really the history of and how we can sort of move towards more beneficial fire over detrimental fire, I think is really an exciting space to chat in. So with that, I'm going to share my screen and give a little bit of talk about few seconds talk about the Nature, Art, and Habitat Residency. Fantastic. Okay, so this is today we have Monica. Thanks so much for joining us, Monica. And my name is Anne LaForti, and I am actually coming in from the Gabrielino Tongva land, unceded land, which is Pasadena, is where I am, but that's also the larger Los Angeles area. And I'm a nature nerd. I love soil, I love fungi, but also like all biology, I think is just really interesting. And so I started these conversations, these nature nerd chats, so that others who are also nature nerds, could join in these conversations. And I think it's kind of fun. So I'm glad that you're here. Thank you so much for joining us. And let's jump right in here. So NAHR, Nature, Art, and Habitat Residency, is a think tank laboratory of multidisciplinary research that is actually located. We have one location in northern Italy in Valtellegio, which you see in the pictures here. And then we also have an outpost in Santa Ynez in Southern California, just north of Santa Barbara, which is the fellowship that I was part of. And Sarah was part of the Valtellegio Fellowship. And our aim is really to like unfold and display a culture that really relates to nature as a source of inspiration. And it's sort of a global consortium, you might say, of annual fellows and alumni who stay on to support this organization through engagement and events just like this one. And let's see here. So here we can see California residency. It's just north of Los Angeles, and Italy is very, very top of the Italian boot, so to speak, in the Italian Alps, just at the foothills of the Italian Alps, I believe. And, we say NAHR is participation. It's really all about engagement. And so we're really glad you're here. We will have an opportunity at the end of this call for question and answer. So we hope that you will, think about your questions during Monica's talk, and that you will engage. And we're really grateful that we have so many partners in helping to sustain this work, and helping us do what we do. We've also had a couple donations come in from all of you, so thank you so much for supporting this work. We really appreciate it. And NAHR started as a residency program, and it's really blossomed into much more. We do conferences, workshops, interviews, both written and recorded, installations. We're really an ideation space for community over time. And you can see some of the things that we've done here. And really exciting news, later this year, we are expecting the birth of our book, the NAHR book, which is a celebration of 10 years of NAHR. And it is a collaboration of many different voices, authors, artists, and so keep an ear out for that. Watch this space, and we will look forward to presenting you with that publication later this year. Actually, we have just opened the residency well, not opened it. Frank is going to be in Santa Ynez Valley for the April spring residency in Santa Ynez. And so we're looking forward to that. And you can be in touch if you want some more information about if you're local and you want to come check out the residency closing, where Frank will be delivering a short talk about his experience and the work that he has done during that. And so with that, I am going to unshare my screen, and actually, Sarah, if you want to give a quick introduction to yourself.
Okay. Hi, everyone. I just like to say I'm really, really thankful to be here and really happy to be connected with NAHR as a conversation both between environmental scientists and researchers and artists. I've been motivated by the idea of the writer Amitav Ghosh has been talking about the fact that the artist's role is to create stories for all of the living beings, seen and unseen, that we can create a representation and a presence for them in the collective mind. And I feel it's very important that we have well-informed connections as well as these artistic representations and explorations of nature so that we can reform our relationship to it. So I'm calling in from the unceded Lenape lands, Lenape Honig, from what is currently known as Brooklyn, New York. I work here as an artist and as an art therapist. So I also come to this from a mental health point of view, understanding that our relationship to nature is really foundational to our relationship to ourselves. And so it's something that I'm going to be very interested in discussing along the way today. But welcome all of you. I'm really glad we all get to be part of this conversation.
Awesome. All right. And with that, actually, what we wanted to do to start out was actually to talk a little bit about the fact that fire is not necessarily just like wildfires, which is what we're probably going to be talking about today, and cultural fire. We wanted to take a moment to honor and remember those that were lost during the Valencia fire in Spain just days ago. I believe there were 9 victims in that fire when it ravaged 2 apartment buildings, tall apartment buildings in Valencia, Spain. And then Sarah, did you want to take a moment as well?
Yes. In regards to the idea of ceasefire, I wrote a few words. A balanced relationship with the living elements reflects a balanced relationship to ourselves and to other humans and beings. It is not within our right to control the elements or others, or even within our ability. Attempts to control always create a disastrous imbalance. We must live instead in cooperation and respect with fire. To create machines of combustion that are used only to kill or destroy is a misuse and disrespect of fire's purpose, resulting in horrifying cruelty against all living things. So we would ask everyone to respect a moment of silence for those in Gaza and around the world who are desperately awaiting a ceasefire so that healing may begin with themselves and their homeland.
Thank you so much, Sarah. All right, and with that, I'm going to share my screen. I have Monica pinned, so you should be able to see her while I'm sharing. Hopefully this works. And I will share the screen, and you will see the slide deck. And as noted, Monica, if you just want to let me know when you're ready for me to go to the next slide or next picture, as it may be.
Yeah, thank you so much, Anne and Sarah, for starting us off. And I really appreciate starting off with talking about the ceasefire and also the fire in Valencia. In all honesty, it required, our current situation really required me to make some alterations to my presentation. And I mean, of course, it has been Free Palestine for decades now. It's not just relevant to this moment, but it seemed, it felt for me, it felt that it behooves me to incorporate what is going on right now into how can we connect land stewardship and land care and something as seemingly niche as beneficial fire to tearing down colonial structures that cause and create genocidal situations and genocide. And so I really appreciate starting off all of this with that sentiment. Yeah, so I am Monica Matthews. I am an ecologist, and I'm also the coordinator for our Prescribed Burn Association in Ventura County. I am currently located in Ojai, which is cool to see someone else who, at least one other person who was in Ojai. And it's also very, very cool to see people from all over the world, from Spain, other parts of the so-called United States. I see a lot of people who I've never met, which is really cool. And I actually do see, of course, I know Anne and Sarah, but I also do see a friend who is a fire practitioner. So it sounds like we have a pretty wide range of experience and kind of interest in fire. I assume you're all interested in fire to a degree, but I saw some people who were like, oh, we'll see how, you know, how fire is a good thing, which is an awesome question to ask. I appreciate that. So next slide, Anne.
And Monica, quickly, would you like us to hold questions till the end, or is it okay? Should I check in with you along the way if there are things in the chat?
Actually,
I think we can.
Yeah, sorry. Let's just have people, if you want to put your questions in the chat, or you can also save them, you know, in your on your side, and we can open it up after she's done.
Okay, that sounds good.
Thank you.
That works for me. Yeah, so some things we're going to go through today. Going to introduce the region where I work, some of the goings on in our landscape where I work, and then I'll talk a little bit about myself and my background and my interests and kind of my entry point into working with fire and working with the land. And then we'll wrap it up in a way that I hope feels kind of, I got this from Anne actually a few months ago, the concept of pointing positive, which isn't to say that we ignore the horrible things happening, but it's always great to have something that indicates to us where we can grow and what we can direct our attentions and our energies to. Next slide. Okay, next slide. Thanks. Okay, so I work for a resource conservation district, which is a state agency, but unlike most state agencies, we are entirely grant funded, almost entirely grant funded. We have, I think, 0.01% tax funded base, but otherwise we're entirely grant funded. We are located in California, in Southern California, just north of LA County, just south of Santa Barbara County. So the area that Anne was talking about where the NAHR takes place in Santa Ynez is about an hour from where I live. Next slide. So there are a lot of different priorities, strategic priorities that we have, and I won't talk too much about RCDs or resource conservation districts, but if you see that black landmark little icon, that's where I work and live also. When I first moved down here, which is actually pretty recent, I kind of thought I was just moving to LA, which turned out to completely be untrue. It's a very rural and ag-based county, and therefore there's a lot of opportunities for land stewardship, which is really cool. Next slide. So this is kind of the goings on of our county, just some population dynamics. And one really important part is that we have a lot of wildland-urban interface, which is basically where human-built communities meet wildland communities of all different types of ecosystems and statuses of land stewardship and land management. And it presents a lot of opportunities for our human-built communities and therefore humans to be exposed to wildfire incidents. Next slide. Here are watersheds. Wildfire presents a pretty scary risk for watersheds, among other aspects of our landscape, but really we are all always in a watershed. You are always in the floodplain or at the top of the mountain where the watershed maybe starts. So watersheds and fire are always a concern no matter where you are. We all need water, and especially if you live in an ag-based county, it's very important. Next slide. So this is me. My entry point into working with the land really started with me being a conservation biologist, which makes sense, my title being conservation ecologist. But today I work much more with restoration. When I first started my career, I was more doing research with wildlife species, tracking animals all over the world, and getting a chance to monitor populations and behavioral characteristics. So this is me with a snake. This is a cat-eyed snake in Costa Rica. And if you can just shift through like the next 5 slides, it's just a bunch of photos of me with all different kinds of snakes. If you aren't getting the message is I love snakes, and that is how I got into working with the land. I also worked with, the next slide I think will be some other species. I also worked with California tiger salamanders. That's me on the right with the California tiger salamander, which is a very rare salamander in kind of Central Coast California. The left is a photo of me with a sea turtle. I'm monitoring her pooping out her eggs, which is like one of the best experiences. And I'm also a botanist, which makes sense for me to become interested in fire. And that's me in the middle looking at some arroyo lupin. Lupin are one of my favorite plants. Next slide. Okay, also, of course, I have a lot of interest in fire. And it seems maybe, to some people perhaps it seems kind of out of left field, but as we're going to get into in a moment, fire is a really ancient part of almost every landscape on Earth. And it's more so true for some landscapes than others. It depends on what types of fuels you have or vegetation types you have in your landscape. But it's so implicitly part of many ecosystems that many species of plants and wildlife have adapted to actually relying on the ways in which fire impacts habitat structure, which is pretty cool. For example, the species that I worked with for my master's degree, which there was a photo in that pile of photos of me with snakes, with one of those snakes. It's called a Massasauga, and they do actually rely on the ways in which fire impacts habitat structure. It opens up spots in the canopy where they can bask. It increases habitat quality on a number of levels. And so it's really important, not only for that species, but other species of wildlife in that ecosystem that they share that ecosystem with. Next slide. So we're going to talk about some pre-colonial land management strategies and kind of where they come from, especially in the Americas, in California, but in other parts of the Americas, in Chile, in parts of Central America. Next slide. Let's see. Yeah, so a long time ago, so long ago that we're still struggling to pin down exactly how long ago, there was a major mega herbivore die-off. And at the same time, there was a major shift in climate. It's very similar to the situation we find ourselves in now, where we have not done a lot, or at least not nearly enough, in our land management practices, which has resulted in a lot of our forests having far too many fuels, basically. We just haven't trimmed back and properly managed our fuels, especially in California, but it's really true throughout the so-called United States, true in parts of Canada. And that mixed with climate change has created a major crisis that has resulted in a lot of the fires that we're seeing, including the Thomas Fire, Woolsey Fire. Those are both fires that were very destructive for Ventura County, where I live and work. And there is a parallel, prehistorically speaking, that resulted in these decadent fuels or excessive fuel loads, hazardous fuel loads, however you want to describe them. And this resulted in human communities from tens of thousands of years ago having to adapt to the situation they found themselves in. Again, very similar to this situation, although we can, to a degree, pin it on ourselves where this situation comes from. We are the ones who haven't been managing our lands properly, but nonetheless, we are having to adapt to the situation in a similar way to the ancestors of the original stewards of this land. Next slide. So this concept that there were these hazardous fuel loads mixed with a climate change is grounded in Western science, but it is also grounded in a lot of indigenous science, in stories of many nations throughout California. There's the story of how Hummingbird got fire, which is an Amamutsan and Rumsen Ohlone story. Hummingbird stole fire from the underground people who were like badgers and used his thin beak to get right through all of the underground creatures that were keeping fire for themselves, and he stole it for the above ground animals. There's the story of how Tolelu got fire for the mountain people. These stories are ancient, are thousands, tens of thousands of years old, and they demonstrate the value and the role of fire for land management, for the original stewards of the lands where we live, including Chumash, for where I live. Next slide. So these are just 3 examples. Don't feel the need to read the text unless you are so inclined. But this is a vastly generalizing summary of some of the land management practices that have been in place in the places where I live, at least in Ventura County, and definitely for a lot of the world. Coppicing is basically an umbrella term for trimming or lopping or thinning, anything like that that takes fuels off of a tree or a plant and moves them somewhere else. There are a lot of things you can do with it after that. Next slide. These are systems of disturbance that are really important, again, for maintaining a certain habitat structure that really supports a wide range of diversity for wildlife, for plants. There are definitely certain plants that rely on these systems of disturbance for either opening up the canopy, for disturbing the soil, all different kinds of cool stuff. And fire, as well as coppicing, can provide these kind of disturbance regimes that really maintain a healthy habitat structure. Next slide. So this is a really cool graphic from the book, Tending the Wild, by M. Cat Anderson. And I love this book. I highly, highly recommend. I'll be sure to send a link to Anne to share with everyone. I'm sure many of you have read it. And she talks a lot about the roles in which humans have played in maintaining disturbance regimes, which, as this graphic shows, keeps plants healthy. There's a sense that we all have to leave the land alone that I think is slowly kind of being removed from the paradigm of land management, which is great. But these kinds of graphics are really helpful in showing exactly why we do want to interact with the land and maintain these disturbance regimes. Next slide. So yeah, so one major problem that we're facing in a lot of our hazardous wildfire events is these excessive fuel loads. There's just so much for some of these fires to burn, and they can get really hot and they can sit in one spot for a long time, which can erode at the soil and decrease water quality. It also makes kind of ends up in a scorched land or scorched earth habitat structure, which is basically just no habitat left. And therefore it really decreases habitat complexity. It can also be a problem before the wildfire comes through. If you just have a monoculture with no habitat structure, wildlife will really have trouble using that habitat to the extent that they would if there was a little bit more complexity, or a mosaic structure is what we also call it. Next slide. So these are some of the benefits, and the benefits could keep going from here. I could talk your ear off. There are a lot of plants that rely on fire to germinate. Are natives to California, like manzanita and ceanothus or California lilac, rely on fire to help them germinate for many of the species in those genera or in the genus. It removes thatch. It can cauterize. If you cut willow and then send a fire through, it'll cauterize the wound on the willow and it won't rot, which is pretty cool. There are some really, really cool attributes for fire in the landscape. Next slide. And And one of the really cool and I mean beyond cool, just crucial parts of community for many communities in many nations, communities, tribes, California, and I'm sure in other parts of so-called United States that I'm not familiar with, are these baskets that Kumeyaay and also Tomba Shimash will make out of the one on the left, the rattlesnake deergrass basket. And the way that you make that basket and properly maintain the deergrass is through using fire to clear out the deergrass. Deergrass is it's a huge bunch of grass. And if you just let it go without maintaining it, it gets clogged with dead grass leaves, that plant. And then you can use the grass leaves and parts. It's incredibly beautiful. I mean, obviously they are amazing, but also are necessary for carrying food. For sometimes you might use the material for making a cradle board for carrying a child. These are really important parts of cultural goings on for nations throughout California and other parts of this region, and I'm sure other parts of the world. Next slide. So now we'll get into some of the parts of the history of California that made it so that indigenous communities and nations and tribes could not properly employ these practices, and also, I mean, these were examples of genocide. Next slide. So humans arrived to California at least 13,000 years ago. There is some evidence that they arrived far earlier than that, 30,000 years ago, so on and so forth. And I say so on and so forth, I know that's very vague. I have a sense that the more evidence we find, the earlier and earlier we will place the arrival of humans in the Americas, and especially on the West Coast. And again, here's our example of the impetus that early humans in this part of the world felt for managing land, and that was why many European settlers noticed this beautiful habitat structure upon their arrival in parts of California. And it's in areas where, at the same time that they expressed, I mean, racists show that they just didn't know what they were talking about, for lack of a better word, because they're observing this incredible land management, the consequences of these incredible land management strategies that these nations were employing. Next slide. So now we'll get into some of the more acute and horrific examples of cultural suppression and genocide. Next slide. So Spanish arrived in actually very, very close to where I live and where I currently am located, about 60 miles up the coast at Point Concepcion in California. That was after arriving in Baja California, but pretty soon after. And pretty immediately employed the mission system, which resulted in malnourishment, overwork. The adobe homes were not structures that were good for living in this part of the world, and they resulted in a lot of disease. And cultural cleansing hit a peak with examples of genocide that we'll go into in the next slide, but also with stopping cultural burning in 1793. Okay, so just some historical points that are important for appreciating the context of what is happening. So Mexico wins independence from Spain, and that transitions California to Mexican rule instead of Spanish rule. And then in 1848, Mexico and the United States signed the treaty, which results in California now being a territory of the United States. This is also the year when John Sutter finds gold, which I have recently learned actually was actually not the first time that gold was discovered. I mean, of course, there's no way it was the first time gold was discovered, but it wasn't the first gold rush, is what I've been told. There was another gentleman who found gold before this, but he was not a white man, so he was not kind of indulged in what he had found. And then 1850, California becomes a state. This is also one of the bloodiest massacres in United States history, actually, if you are familiar with the area of Clear Lake, which is probably about 8 hours north, driving north. Us Californians think of everything in the amount of time it takes for us to get there in a car. Additionally, though, I don't know the Holcomb Valley area to have resulted in any genocidal incidents. There was another gold rush in Southern California, which I feel is relevant. The gold rush in general, especially in the northern part of California, was the origin of a lot of genocide in California. There was a sense that settlers who came here to look for gold just wanted indigenous communities gone so that they could more fully establish in this area and take all of the gold and other resources that they were finding for themselves. Next slide. Now we're coming into an era where a lot of the relationships with the land are changing and shifting and adapting. We're employing what a lot of Western scientists would call adaptive land management strategies. But there's a psychological, a very positive psychological impact related to these
we can take some questions. Sarah, did you see any questions come into the chat?
We do have some appreciation here for weaving that to know that there's like a purpose to finding materials or like maintaining weaving materials through prescribed fires or beneficial fires, which is also something that I think is true in New York. As I've been reading more about this, I found like that is part of the reason that the Mohawk would like to do more beneficial fires in upstate New York, is that there are particular materials for handmade and crafts that they've been and tools and that they've been using forever. And some of those materials are squeezed out by particularly like I think in the north along the Great Lakes, there are a lot of reeds that become like a dangerous fuel load, as Monica was saying, and also squeeze out necessary plants for other works and livelihoods.
Awesome. Yeah. I think I saw that comment too. Thank you, Leslie. Leslie's the lead of the SoCal Fiber Shed. If anybody is in Southern California and wants to get involved, that organization is a global organization, and her chapter is for Southern California. I'm just going to mute people if they come off mute accidentally. And then I specifically love this connection to weaving, to the fiber shed, because of course I'm a soil nerd, and I think it really helps us go back and back and back and look at the cycling of like that when we use natural materials, we are growing them from the soil. We are using and sort of letting the microbes provide the nutrients to the plants, and then we harvest the plants and we use them in baskets, in clothing, in materials, and then at the end of their life we can compost them back into the soil to contribute back, and that cycle just sort of blows my mind a bit, so I love that.
Yeah, we also have questions coming in about and these are all kind of related to questions that I have too about upstate New York for right now, but how often does your conservation district do prescribed burns? How like
Yeah, so I can speak to those the questions from Deborah and Ilaria. Both great questions. So we did 4 prescribed burns last year. One of them was a pile burn, and 3 of them were broadcast burns, which is basically just burning without piles. You just burn whatever is still connected to the earth. And we went for a grant to do 13 burns, which would not happen in 1 year. That would be over 3 to 5 years. They requested that you try to get as much of the work done as early in the grant cycle as possible. So that would probably be 3 to 5 burns per year. We also want to do, there's a training that happens all over different parts of California, different times of the year, called a training exchange. Elizabeth and I, who put her stuff in the chat, went to one in Santa Barbara, in Santa Ynez, in November. And it's if you can imagine what it's like to be on a burn together with any person, any group, for just 4 to 5 hours in one day, it's like that times 12, because you're with a group of people for like a week to 2 weeks, and you might burn 2 to 3 times, might burn more. Some of those events, they're called TREXs, training exchange, the TREX. They try to get you burning like most days of like a week to 2 week period. So we want to do something like that in Ventura County, probably something more modest, maybe burning once or twice over a week to 2 weeks. So that's probably putting about 4 to 6 burns on the map per year. But that's something to look to. We did our first burn in Ventura County, January 2023. So it's early days for Ventura County. But we have a lot of people who have come to Ventura County after doing this work in other parts of the state for years, other parts of the country. First time I worked with fire was in Michigan, actually, with this rattlesnake that I worked with for my master's. So we're really kind of trying to bring some knowledge and experience to Ventura County, which isn't to say that it's not here already. It's just that it's being used for other parts of fire management, that's the knowledge base in regards to fire, or it isn't supported by grants or community, which isn't to say community is a roadblock. You just need to kind of have these conversations with community, and that takes time, and that takes money unto itself to make time for that and to design those educational programs, which speaks to the question that Ilaria had about air pollution. That's a great question. So we have air pollution control districts in California, all over California. I work with the Ventura County Air Pollution Control District and also with the Santa Barbara County Air Pollution Control District. And they are in the business of protecting communities from the impacts of air pollution, which smoke would be considered a pollutant. So basically, to mitigate for that, you have to come up with a smoke management plan that says, I will apply fire in these ways, and I will apply it at this time of day, that with the winds being as they are at this time of day, and you also call it, with lift, mixing height has to be pretty high to allow the smoke column to go straight up, rather than the smoke just sits on the ground, which will cause a problem for local communities. You have to come up with all of these mitigation strategies, and then you present that smoke management plan to Air Pollution Control District. And a lot of the time they choose to be on the burn day of. Our Air Pollution Control District is really, really supportive. They are aware of the ways in which prescribed burning can help us mitigate for wildfires, and wildfires are the real bad actor in the world of smoke management and smoke issues. So they're aware of the benefits that prescribed fire has, even in managing smoke. But if things aren't going as planned day of for when you do a burn, and the smoke just isn't acting as you thought it was, maybe you have some winds that weren't forecasted, or mixing height isn't as high as was forecasted, Air Pollution Control District can shut it down. And that's a part of prescribed fire that is a little awkward and unfortunate. But the more that prescribed burn associations build capacity, the more it won't be a problem. That sometimes day of, the relative humidity is not what you thought it was going to be. Sometimes you didn't get the right number of engines that had promised that they would be there to help you manage the fire. Any of a number of things can make it so that you get all these resources day of, you're all together, you're about to do your briefing, and you have to say, sorry, we're not going to burn today. And it can be really unfortunate. But the more that we get prescribed burn associations that can be agile, rather than rely on institutions to do this work that can be like 200 people per burn with like 10 engines, that's a lot of resources to gather, to then say we're not going to do it, it can really create a problem for making these projects happen. So prescribed burn associations are really beneficial to just being able to be agile, if that makes sense, especially when it comes to issues like smoke, and other problems you encounter when you're trying to make a burn happen, if that makes sense. Looking for other questions.
I think we also have one of the oh
Go ahead, Sarah.
I guess also Andreas is asking about how to approach the fears that people have of fire, of like the fear that it will be out of control, that they'll be at risk, which is also something that's being cited in New York, upstate New York. It's illegal in the Catskills and the Adirondacks to do prescribed fire, even though it's being used in some other areas, and it's being used in Connecticut, I believe. Because there's a feeling that like there's little risk of wildfire. So they're like, why do we have to introduce a risk? So I guess at the beginning of the 20th century, there were actually like tremendous wildfires in New York State because of the timber industry. They cut down so many trees that it left like the land very dry and left a ton of fuel. And there were like horrible wildfires that shadowed New York with smoke. But since they did work on a lot of regrowth and revitalization, there's more of a forest now. There's people feel that there's less risk, even though last June we were coated in smoke several days from the Canadian wildfires. It was so dark that I had to turn on a light in the middle of the day. So how is it that like and I'm sure this happens through small conversations or passing on of information, but like talk to people about this, their sense that fire is so unpredictable.
Yeah, so that's a good question. Just in general, I think a lot of prescribed burn, just people, practitioners, organizers, fire professionals are nervous about the ways in which just human qualities can present some mercurial feelings about this work. And I would say just education as a first step is really useful. It doesn't, if you just get a grant just to do education, just to talk about land management strategies, it doesn't have to have this undertone of, once we get to a certain level of educating you guys as in, community, we're going to do prescribed burning. It can be just, let's just talk about this. Let's talk about the history.
Susanna Ollinger is asking about, I know she's asking Monica, but just in the moment, to what extent has the Federal Bureau of Land Management accepted the ideas? And I think it seems like in California, they're working in conjunction with the Parks Department. So and quite a lot of other departments as well, but it was made illegal for many decades and is still illegal in some places. So it's slowly, like piece by piece and conversation by conversation, collaborations are being built. I don't know that there are many places, unless it's on like indigenous reservations where people are independently doing any prescribed fire.
And actually that speaks to a little foreshadowing. We are hoping to have, his name is Jerry Bird from the National Forest Service in a future Nature Nerd chat. So watch this space, and we'd love to, have that question followed up with when he is presenting as well. So thanks for leading into that. As a side note, so regarding the Nature Art and Habitat Residency, I know there's a few fellows that are on today, but if you are interested in applying or learning more information, you can go to the website, which is the first letters of Nature Art and Habitat Residency, so NAHR.IT. That's their website because it is an Italian organization. And there's lots of information there. You can also reach out to myself. Thanks, Doe, for putting that in the chat. You can reach out to myself or Sarah, or if you know others that are fellows in this organization, we're happy to chat and give you some information. It looks like Valeria shared the Slow the Burn Symposium link as well. So thank you so much for doing that.
Yeah.
So Sarah, do you want to just restate the question from Suzanne?
Right. So Susanna was asking about the Bureau of Land Management and their acceptance or support in general of this.
That's a great question. Yeah, and given the complexities of what the BLM tends to lease their lands for, which is often for oil, they're not always super thrilled to have prescribed fire on their land. They actually have their own prescribed fire training rubric. And I do think they do prescribed fire along with prescribed burn associations throughout the state, I should say, like speaking broadly, and in other parts of the country.
I know in New York that they're the Mohawk and the National Parks Department are
work in BLM. Depend on what the leaser is doing on that project. I would say there's a wide range. In Ventura County, there's like one little splotch of land where BLM owns the land, and we haven't done any even talk about prescribed fire there, but it's kind of on the list, I guess I'll say. Yeah.
Yeah. We have a great question coming in from Frank Shalache, who's going to be the resident in California coming up in April. Frank is a enamored beekeeper, And so he's saying that we have a large scale almond pollination and concerns surrounding bees in his area. He's up around Marina, California right now. And that they have concerns about changes in the agricultural industry surrounding types of pesticides, timing for their application, and increasing like wildflower plantings to mitigate some of this. But he's saying, are there any species conservation efforts that are linked to fire or influenced by science surrounding fire?
Annie.
Uh-huh.
Hi, it's Do here. I'm also a fellow from NAHR, and I had a question maybe for you. As you're a soil nerd, maybe do you have any insight and information about potentially how prescribed fire benefit soil? Maybe nurture it in any way?
It really depends on how deep the fire goes, right? So that's why the idea of having prescribed burn is much better for the soil than something like a wildfire might be, because a wildfire will burn very hot and deeply into the soil and kill off the microbes in, so deep into the soil, so that it takes a lot longer for that microbiome to come back. And whereas prescribed burns usually sort of go much quicker and sort of eat up what's on top, the fuel that's on top of the soil, and has less of a detrimental impact on the microbiome itself underneath. There are definitely trees. I want to say the lodgepole pine, but there's other tree species of seeds that actually require fire, right? There's this idea of scarification on seeds where sometimes you have to like scrape them on some sandpaper if you want them to get them to germinate. But some seeds actually require that that fire to be able to sort of let them know that it's time to germinate and grow, because I believe sort of evolutionarily, it's similar to what Monica was saying about the snake habitat, where if everything's all covered up, there's nowhere to get the sun. There's no open spaces, and so fire going through more quickly will be able to provide some open spaces and sort of signal to those seeds that it is time to germinate.
Yep. And it seems like from some of the reading that I had done, that like opening spaces or like creating areas that were, grasslands with some trees, but not completely dense, also brought in game, rabbits and deer that could be hunted there. And it also made it less likely to have wildfires later.
It's really interesting too, this idea of like more patchiness, right? So if you have a wildfire that's going through, it's very hot, it's burning everything in its path. It's, as they say, scorched earth, right? Whereas if you have the patchiness, you can actually build diversity in the microbes and in the plants that come back, versus having a monocrop of like all of the same plant. That, like, for example, in Southern California, actually all of California, we have so much invasive mustard, right? And the mustard grows more quickly than the other plants, and therefore it shuts out the ability of these other plants to be able to grow. But if you have patchiness underneath the fire, then it allows for more diversity to be able to come back up.
If you don't mind me coming back.
Yeah, go ahead.
I'm just curious about this because I've heard about oxidized grass being a problem. I've heard Alan Savory talk about this with his methodology of holistic management, in which he is really concerned about correctly using planned grazing to prevent grass from like seasonal grass from oxidizing, because that really affects the soil in a bad way. It makes it maybe acidify over time.
Yep,
Prevents it from
absolutely.
being able to absorb water and all of that. So potentially, if you in the situation of lacking enough grazing animals, having prescribed fire maybe help in not damaging the grass in the sense of oxidized grass.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I know I've studied a bit of Alan Savory's work, and in what we call a brittle environment, which is, it's not necessarily arid because it has, we get the rain during the winter and then no rain during summer and then rain in the winter again. One of the things is when you're having grazing animals, if you don't graze those grasses, then they do oxidize and they lose that nutrient base for those grazing animals. And it's basically, it's oxidized. So there's nothing, the value isn't there. It's really just fuel at that point. And so that's really the key of getting the animals on the land before it oxidizes. Otherwise, it is turned into basically fire fuel. And sometimes you need them to graze on that to get rid of it. So instead of having it turn into a fire, and oftentimes ranchers will, douse it with, now I can't think, molasses, because the cows like molasses and the goats like molasses. And so a little bit of sugar helps the medicine go down, I guess.
So yeah, actually, it's interesting. We're talking about prescribed grazing. I have a little bit of a background in rangeland management, it's especially interesting in California, where most of our grasslands have been heavily impacted by European annual grasses, which have this wide range of value to cattle. Cattle are obviously a lot of what are grazing out here. As you pointed out, we lost a lot of our native grazing wildlife, especially like elk, and bighorn sheep are, to an extent, are grazers. They're a little bit more browsers, and deer are pretty much browsers. So a browser is an animal that eats more like shrubby stuff, like oak leaves and acorns and stuff that gets a little bit bigger. Grazers are animals that graze grass. So that would be like elk and cattle. And there's a very different impact that those different animals have on the ecosystem. And it's really important, if you are doing any sort of rangeland management with cattle, that you make sure that they eat the grass at the right time of year and that they have the right kind of grass available to eat, which unfortunately, it's ironic that it's European cattle that brought it in. A lot of these annual grasses that are now dominant in a lot of grassland ecosystems have very little value to cattle. Some of them are just not very tasty, and some of them are can be deadly. Ripcut brome can get stuck in cattle rumen and can kill them if they don't get pretty quick attention from a veterinarian. So it, as you said, it results in the grasses not getting eaten, and then they senesce or oxidize, as you say, and then you just have the fuel left. And it's really flashy and can actually result in really deadly situations for example, for fire professionals if they're trying to put out a fire, and it's these kinds of annual grasses that make up a lot of the vegetation. That's actually where the majority of deaths from trying to suppress fires has been from these flashy annual grasses. So it presents for problems on a number of levels. It can really damage the ecosystem and can heat up the soil too much. These fires can get really, really hot. It can present really deadly situations for our suppression people, our firefighters, and can move really quickly and have really adverse effects. The fire moves really quickly and can have really adverse effects on our built communities in ways that we really struggle to manage. So yeah, I mean, as you're saying, we have a lot of issues related to these fuels and the status of our grazers especially in California, but I imagine there are kind of parallel issues in other parts of the world.
Anyone else have any other questions, or if you want to come off mute and ask your question live? All right. Well, then I think we can close it out. Thank you so much, Monica, for joining us on this talk today. Thank you to Sarah for being my co-host. And thank every single one of you for showing up and being part of this chat. We really appreciate it. I will be sending out through the Eventbrite emails a link to the recording of this. And if you go to that link, it will also have a bunch of these links that Monica provided so that you can quickly and easily just click through them from there. We are so glad you've joined us. Please be aware that this is a series. And so we are going to have more talks about fire later this year. So be on the lookout. We will send out invites in the same manner that you received them now. Ilaria, have I missed anything?
No, you did great job. Thank you very much. Thank you everybody for joining us. And we are looking forward to seeing you in person and or remotely at the next appointment. Thank you, Sarah and Monica, everyone in the team. This was really interesting. We are just starting, getting warm.
Kindling. Yeah, and it seems like as Monica was talking about, like the agility of these community groups that have to come together and have this intimate knowledge of like specific tasks and specific care that needs to be done. It seems like even just these small conversations and getting to meet all of you from around the world and share thoughts and support and questions about this is kind of the way to begin. So thank you everybody for being here.
All right. Have a great Sunday, everybody. Bye.
Enjoy,
Bye.
guys.
Bye.
Thank you.
so much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.